still kind of wondering why that song said that this creature leaps. How would that even be possible? Alright, so tonight's discussion is on both versions of the Blob, and in these movies, a meteor lands in a small town, and out of that meteor comes a monster which has no arms or legs, no face, and no powers of reasoning as we understand it. The only capacity that it possesses is to feed on life until there is none left. Now, in talking about the supporting cast of the Blob, one of the key differences between these two movies is that in the original everyone plays it a little more straight, whereas there's a little more comedy in the remake. Like, one of the funniest scenes for me is when this guy goes into a store to buy some condoms. An even bigger difference is that the original film didn't have any villains in it aside from the Blob itself. I remember when I was watching this movie for the first time, there were these three buddies that approached the main character who I almost thought were going to be the villains of the movie, because in that scene where they're introduced, they almost come off as bullies, but then right after that it turns out they're completely harmless. About the closest that you do get to a human antagonist in the original is with these cop characters and adult characters in general who don't believe the stories that these teenagers are telling them, but really you can't blame them. I mean, it would sound pretty crazy if somebody came up to you saying that there was a ball of slime going around eating people. One of the main themes of the original Blob was that they wanted to create this scary movie that would appeal to younger audiences by giving them characters who they could relate to, and it does have some very well-written teenage heroes. In the remake, the cops are a little more douchey as they dismiss what the younger characters are saying, and it does introduce more human villains during the second act who aren't necessarily the deepest or most original villainous characters, but they do get the job done. They are the types of characters who you can hate as people. And then as far as the main characters in each film go, in the original you've got Steve McQueen playing a guy named Steve. I love it when actors do that. And his girlfriend, and they're both fairly simple characters, but they are very likable and heroic characters who the audience can get behind. With the remake, you've got this cookie-cutter bad boy character who wears a leather jacket and rides a motorcycle and has been to juvenile a few times, but he's also got a heart of gold. And then you've got this cheerleader played by Shawnee Smith, who some of you may remember from the Saw films, and she is much stronger than the female lead from the original. She's much more physically active. So if you're looking for a better female heroine in your horror movies than what you typically get, this one may be right up your alley. Now then, getting into the Blob, this isn't going to be a very long video. In the original, the special effects are pretty low grade by today's standards, but they're still fairly well done. You do get the impression that this is a living creature, and it was also fairly gruesome for the time that it came out. Like, when you first get a glimpse of the monster, it's very clear and colorless, but then once it starts feeding on people, it starts to turn red, which suggests that it's gorging itself on their blood. The only problem with the Blob in the original is that it's very slow moving and that you could easily escape it by walking at a brisk pace. With the remake, of course, the special effects are much more advanced, but aside from that, the monster moves a lot quicker, so there is more of a sense of danger to it. And then the death scenes are a lot nastier in the remake. Like, there's one point where this guy gets pulled into a narrow drain pipe, and then in the scene right after that, there's a moment where the creature is sliding down this glass wall and you can see a partially digested face in the slime. So again, it is pretty disgusting. If you are easily squeamish, then this film might not be for you. And then another thing that I liked about the deaths was that nobody was really safe in this movie. I'm not going to give away any spoilers here, but It's a commonly known fact that in movies certain characters are usually spared just so that the director can play it safe, but that wasn't the case with this movie, and they established this more than once. As far as my complaints go with the Blob as it is portrayed in the remake, one thing that was just straight up cheesy about it was that they actually gave it a voice. There's one point where I'm pretty sure I could hear it roaring, and then much later in the film, there's a scene where it blasts out of this manhole and you can actually hear it shrieking. That just wasn't needed. And then another thing that is not needed and that they could have just taken out of the movie and it wouldn't have affected the story at all is that they actually give the Blob an origin in the remake, and it involves those human villains that I mentioned earlier. It's not even completely original, it's completely cliched and again just isn't necessary. In conclusion, the remake of The Blob is not a perfect movie. I do have some complaints with it when it comes to how cheesy and cliched it is in some aspects, but at the same time I do like how the characters have a little more edge and sense of humor to them, as well as the fact that it packs more of a punch when it comes to the horror aspects and comes a little closer to making this ball of slime look scary. The original is a very fun and entertaining monster movie, but I think that the remake is a little bit better. Anyway, that's all I've got to say for this comparison. I hope you all have a good one.